Okay, can start now.
So thank you for being here. And we will present the study that Patrick already mentioned. We collected data in Switzerland. This study is already published in BLC, but it's the first time we actually present this particular study. So we are very excited to present this data. Well, it's very interesting. You can next. Yeah, Esther. Okay, so this study is the result of an invitation by the coordinator of the Portuguese heritage language classes, the EPE Suiza, so Portuguese teaching abroad is this called, from the Instituto Camões. The coordinator, Lourdes Gonçalves, invited me to organize a workshop for the teachers of Portuguese as a heritage language in Switzerland. And this project is the result of this invitation. So we organized a workshop, but we thought it would be interesting to involve the teachers also in data collection and coding, because the workshop, the topic was heritage language development. So we collected data. That was the first part of this project, with the help of the teachers during the heritage language classes. So it was in 19, so before the COVID pandemic. And then we had this teacher training workshop. I was there in Switzerland, and then Esther and Jacopo joined us. And we did the data analysis and a final teacher workshop where we presented the results. So Esther, next. And in fact, Portuguese as a heritage language it's very interesting to study Portuguese in Switzerland, because the Portuguese-speaking community in Switzerland is the third largest immigrant group in Switzerland after the Italians and the Germans. And there's a very good and well-established network of Portuguese heritage language classes, which around 8,000 students, a bit less now, it's a bit decreasing, but more than 7,000 students in the age span from 6 to 18, so all the school years. And most of them are second-generation children from Portuguese immigrant families. So this network also has children, for example, from Brazilian families or Cape Verdean, but most of them are Portuguese immigrant families. And they are the network employed 75 teachers, and the classes are, as it is typical for heritage language classes, they are not integrated in the school system, but they are offered at afternoon classes in several schools. And what is really interesting is that they are offered in all parts of Switzerland, so in different cantons with different majority languages. So we collected data from children living in the French cantons, in the German cantons, and in the Italian canton. So we don't have data from Romansh, but from Portuguese German, Portuguese French, and Portuguese Italian. And it's the same country. That's also very interesting. So the data collection was during the classes and in both languages. So the instruments, we will present them in more detail, but all instruments were adapted to Portuguese, German, French, and Italian. And we tested more than 400 children. with a detailed, very detailed language background questionnaire that was filled out by the parents, and it was in Portuguese, a closed test in all these languages, and then a written story that was a retelling task also in all these languages. And in this particular study, we will focus on the background questionnaire and the closed test. Yeah, Esther? Did you skip one? No.
No.
Okay, sorry. Okay. So I think it's in this particular context, I don't need to go into details about heritage language development, but just to recall that heritage language acquisition takes place under very specific language exposure conditions, because the children are acquiring the heritage language from very early on. So all of the children we tested had contact with Portuguese from birth and within their families. So it's a kind of native language acquisition. But there is, as soon as they start to go into kindergarten and then school, we know that there is more contact with the majority language, and their exposure gets divided between the two languages. They have then less exposure to the heritage language, and exposure to the majority language increases. And normally this comes along with dominance changes also, so they get more dominant in the majority language. And this is what research has shown. It seems to lead to some differences in the acquisition pace, and also in some domains in the acquisition outcome. And there are, of course, many variables that we know are very important in language development in general, and also in heritage language development. These are some of the variables, and also the ones we tested. So the age of onset of acquisition, in this case of the majority language, because we know the heritage language is normally the first language, but then there are differences in the timing of acquisition of the majority language, and several input factors. For example, how many people within the family speak the heritage language, how often they speak the heritage language, even if they integrated in an immigrant community and have contact with the language outside or not. So all these input factors. Then the richness, so in which context the language is used, if it's only within the family, or also outside in different contexts, and the literacy skills. And these are the main research questions of our study. So the first question was, how is the overall performance in the closed test? How is it affected by the input factors in this case? And as input factors, we had the amount of use of the heritage language at home, and the degree of instruction in Portuguese, so in this Portuguese heritage language classes. And also the age of onset of bilingualism, so when they started to acquire the other language, the majority language. And the second question is if we can, through the closed test, distinguish between easy and difficult structures in the test, and if the difference in this degree of difficulty is somehow correlated with the input factors. And now Esther will continue.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so here are the predictions of our study. We expect that structures will cluster around different levels of difficulty. For example, we expect that some structures may be more demanding and more difficult for the children. The second prediction is that we expect an effect of background variables on the children's performance in the closed test. So, for example, we think that formal instruction, amount of input, variety of input, and later age of onset of the environmental language could have a positive effect. And of course, we also think that older children should exhibit a better knowledge in Portuguese than the younger ones. And if we compare variables related to input quality and input quantity, we think that the variables related to input quality, so the variety of input and also the literacy of the children, so the fact of formal instruction, should be more relevant than variables related to the quantity of the input. The third prediction is that we think, or we predicted that there's an interaction between background variables and difficulty of certain structures in the test. So we expect easier items to be less sensitive to background variables than more complex ones. And the last expectation or prediction was that we expect an interaction between language combination and difficulty of the items on response accuracy, because some of the contact languages are more typologically close to the heritage language. So, for example, Italian, and German is typologically further away from Portuguese. So the typological proximity between the heritage language and the societal language may have a positive effect on response accuracy, especially with respect to the most difficult structures in the test. 180 children participated in the test. We had, as Cristina already said, 3 groups of bilingual children, 60 French Portuguese, 60 German Portuguese, and 60 Italian Portuguese children living in 3 different areas of Switzerland. And all these children acquired Portuguese as a heritage language from birth and the societal language before the age of 6, except for 10 children who acquired it between 7 and 11 years. But this difference is only concerns the societal language, not the heritage language, not Portuguese. As Cristina already said in the beginning, we had a background questionnaire which was very detailed, and we asked the parents about a lot of different variables and exposure and input variables. And we had a closed test in Portuguese with different structures and linguistic domains. And of course, the children also did the narrative test, and they also did the closed test in the other language, but we will predominantly focus on the Portuguese closed test in this talk. We analyzed children's accuracy in each structure of the closed test, leaving aside orthographic errors, and we did a cluster analysis to group items into different groups of difficulty. So as I said, the background questionnaire collected a lot of information about the situation of Portuguese as a heritage language in the family, and what we considered for this study, what was especially the age of the children, of course, then also the socioeconomic status of the parents, which was calculated as the mean between the educational level of each parent, with 1 representing the lowest educational level and 6 the highest one. We also took into account the amount of exposure to Portuguese So how often the heritage language is spoken with each family member, including grandparents. And we attributed a frequency value from 1 to 5 and associated that with each family member, and then calculated and added then the different frequency values to each other. We also investigated the factor heritage language school, which was a multiplication between the number of years the child attended a heritage language class, the number of school weeks in a year, and the number of hours per week spent in the school. And then the last factor was the exposure to the societal language, French, German, or Italian, which was measured in age of first exposure in months. So each of this factor could have been calculated or considered in a different way, but we decided to do it in this way, just to have just to operationalize these factors for our study. The cloze test was based on a short narrative modeled after a story of the Edmonton Narrative Norms instrument. And this cloze test included 40 gaps, which were informed by linguistic criteria. So we selected, for example, both function and content words. For the function words, the whole word was deleted, or we provided the initial letter, and you can see this in the example. So in the example, what is lacking there is the complementizer que. So the child sees that there are 3 gaps and has to fill in these gaps. And then we had also content words, and in content words we gave the first half of the word, and the children had to fill in the gaps as well, and they knew the number of letters they had to fill in. So in the example, it would be uma cadelinha muito divertida. Okay, so the procedure was that the test was executed as a paper and pencil test. The paper contained the text with gaps, as well as 3 figures representing episodes of the narrative. And as I already said, the gaps indicated the length of the words, and each gap corresponded to only 1 letter. And we gave the children more or less 30 minutes to complete the test. So we included in this test different structures of Portuguese, and here I give you some examples of the different morphosyntactic domains, which we relate to different degrees of complexity. And I think Jacopo will say a few words about that later. So the structures included in the test were, for example, nominal and verbal morphology, as, for example, the inflection of an inflected infinitive in this first example, or contracted and non-contracted preposition. In the example, you see a contracted preposition, and then, of course, different types of subordinators and subordinate clauses, adverbial subordinate clauses, complement clauses, but also relative clauses. Here in the example, you see an example of a subject-relative clause. And we had also clitic pronouns in different syntactic constellations, and for example, the clitic allomorph in the example that you see on the slide. And we also had some definite and indefinite articles in our cloze test, and also some nouns, for example, that tested lexical knowledge. So I think, Jacopo, you start now.
Yeah. Exactly. So we, thank you, Esther. So we coded actually these items according to whether the response was correct, incorrect. And so we had actually these two-level coding. And we also coded actually these answers were like not expected, but correct. And you can see an example here. So actually we have a binary variable, which is our outcome variable, and then we consider actually how this binary variable is related to the different language exposure measures that we saw previously. So now I will go through the results of the study and with respect to the hypothesis that we formulated at the beginning. And you will see actually that some hypotheses were actually confirmed and other hypotheses were not confirmed. So let's see this dendrogram from the beginning. So this dendrogram emerges actually from the cluster analysis of which Esther was referring to before. So the main idea behind the cluster analysis is actually to identify those items that pattern together with respect to a certain variable. Of course, the variable that we consider here is the accuracy score that is associated with the variables. So in other terms, this cluster analysis identify which items actually pattern similarly with respect to their accuracy score. And you could see here that the cluster analysis identifies two big clusters. You can see it from the fork at the beginning. So you see the cluster on the left side that contains most of the items. That contains items such as, for example, regular, nominal, verbal, and adjectival inflection, negation, reflexive clitics. And this is quite interesting because we will have the other cluster with third-person clitics, subordinate connectors introducing adverbial clauses, so such as, for example, causal clauses or temporal clauses. And then we go to the other cluster, which is made of different structures, and it's on the right. And you could see here third-person clitics, relative and concessive ke, contracted prepositions such as pela that we saw before, and inflected infinitives. And it is interesting to notice that most of this structure actually tend to emerge quite late in Portuguese monolingual language acquisition. So there seems to be like a nice correlation between the timing of acquisition of these structures and the difficulty of the structure, because of course our idea is that these clusters represent two levels of difficulty. So the red structures before were the easy structure, and the blue structures now are the difficult structures. So this classification is at the basis of the models that we will show after. So next slide. And here you could see what is the relationship of these structures, so these two levels of difficulty of the structure with respect to age. So this graph actually plots the probability of providing a correct answer based on increasing age. So you see age on the x-axis, and you see the probability on the y-axis. And you could see here that actually with increasing age, we have an increasing probability of providing a correct answer, both with items that are actually most difficult, which are the blue one, and items that are actually at easiest, which are the red one. And you could see the same pattern across the two items. Of course, the items that are more difficult are less likely to be answered correctly, as you can see from the fact that the line is below. But let's see what happens now with formal instruction in the next slide. With formal instruction, we have actually more interesting results with respect to this, because as in the case of age, we see that the greater the formal instruction to Portuguese, the greater the probability of providing a correct answer. And this actually applies to both items at level 1 and item at level 2. However, what we found here is also an interaction between the level of difficulty of the item and the amount of formal instruction. And I will describe a bit the picture in order to understand where this interaction goes to. So you could see here that if you go to the left side of the graph, so this means like low formal exposure to Portuguese, you could see that with the easy structure, so the structure at level 1, it is still highly likely that the children produce a correct answer. So you see that the likelihood is around 65%, which is pretty high. But on the contrary, with items at level 2, this probability is quite low. It is around actually 25%, so ranging between 40% and 20%. And what's happening with high exposure? So with items at level 1, so we have almost 100% probability of finding a correct answer. So this means that with formal exposure, children tend to perform at ceiling. We don't see this ceiling performance with the items at level 2. We just see a relevant increase in the number of correct answers, but this increase reaches like around 60%, ranging between like 40% and 70%. So this is actually the reason why we see this interaction. So we also run other models in order to see actually the effect of other variables in the next slide. And we did not find any actually effect of amount of exposure. So do you remember that we calculated the quantity of language exposure and we found no effect of this? We also find no effect of the age of acquisition of the societal language, which was Italian, German, or French. And we also found no effect of language combination. And this was particularly interesting because actually we expected that the societal languages, such as, for example, Italian and French, would facilitate, in some sense, the acquisition of certain phenomena, such as clitics, for example. But actually, we found that French Portuguese, German Portuguese, and Italian Portuguese children pattern the same with respect to the acquisition path that we saw previously. And then, next slide. What we found, as we saw in the previous slide, is that actually we found this effect of age, which means actually that a certain cognitive maturity, but also a certain linguistic maturity is actually required in order to answer correctly to a certain item. And we also find an effect of the complexity of the acquisition task. So what we said previously is that the timing of acquisition of certain structure in monolingual language acquisition actually plays a role in the acquisition process of heritage children. And of course, what we found is that we found a strong effect of literacy. And this is quite interesting with respect to what Esther was referring to. So Esther distinguished between quantitative and qualitative variables with respect to language experience. And literacy can be considered among the qualitative, actually, variables. And this is quite interesting to see that literacy, so formal instruction, focus on form, enhances the acquisition of the most difficult structure. It should be considered, however, that our task was a written task. So there might be actually a task effect here, because of course the written part, the written testing is more sensitive towards formal instruction and exposure to actually literacy exposure in Portuguese. And then in the next slide, so to summarize actually what we saw in the previous slide, we could identify among the items of the closed test, 2 levels of difficulty, so 2 big clusters in some sense. And the most difficult structures are actually critic pronouns, subordinate clauses, especially embedding in some sense and not adverbial clauses, and prepositions that are quite complex also in monolingual language acquisition. We also find a positive effect of age and literacy, And what is interesting is that this effect of literacy was in interaction with the level of complexity of the items. So in some case, we saw that the items at level 1, so the easiest items, were less sensitive to this formal instruction with respect to the most difficult items, because we saw that there was like this ceiling effect with the easiest structure. But contrary to our actually prediction, we did not find any effect of amount of exposure, and we did not find any effect of acquisition of the second language, so age of acquisition of the second language, nor any effect of cross-linguistic effect of the societal language. But of course, we found an effect of the complexity of the structure on accuracy. So as I said before, this points in the direction of the relevance of qualitative variables with respect to input for heritage language acquisition. Not only formal instruction, but also the size of the community, as Cristina was mentioning before. So the community is quite large, and this offers children the opportunity to speak Portuguese with different persons. And from another point of view, I can tell you that actually we found a correlation in our preliminary analysis between the accuracy score and the number of persons with which the children actually interacted. Not the quantity of exposure, but the number of persons with which the children interacted. So this is actually the summary of our study, and so we thank you very much for the attention, and yeah, for the participation in this seminar, and to all the people that actually helped us in data collection, data analysis, and yeah, for the support. Thank you very much.